So welcome everyone to the BMRC's Fellows Fall Speaker Series. Today our speaker is Dr. Nicholas Kryczka. Dr. Kryczka is a assistant professor of secondary education for social studies at National Louis University and a scholar in residence at the Newberry Library. He is a historian and teacher educator whose work explores the political and intellectual history of urban school reform in the late 20th century Chicago. His current book traces the continuity from the desegregation debates of the 1960s and 70s to the rise of school choice and accountability, revealing how post-civil rights education policies reshaped urban neighborhoods, empowered nonprofit actors in local politics, and positioned Chicago as a national laboratory for education reform. Hopefully joining us later to be a discussant with Dr. Kryczka is Dr. Toussaint Lossier, who is an associate professor at the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and who is a historian whose work focuses on the grassroots responses to mass incarceration in post-war Chicago. You are free to read the rest of his bio and the flyer and that's on our website, but for the sake of time, we will move on as I just introduce you briefly to the BMRC before our speaker takes the stage. So just for those who are new to the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, we are an expanding consortium of 28 members who strives to cultivate and steward a network of all who seek to document, share, understand, and preserve Black experiences in the Chicago metropolitan area. Currently, this is a list of our members. We're very grateful, and we have some new members joined us just this year and also last year. And our fellows do research with their collections. And this is a list of our 2025 summer cohort, and you can see that Dr. Nick Kryczka was one of the cohorts that was here and this summer using BMRC member archives to forward their own research. And we're happy to say that Dr. Kryczka joins an honorable group of fellows who then go on to produce many publications, articles, books, plays, books of poetry. And so we are looking forward to seeing his book come out. And just to know that these kinds of research fellowships that we give, the money for these comes from donations that we receive, and it's, nothing is guaranteed. So if you would like to support this kind of research and this kind of scholarship, please do consider giving to the BMRC, and you can find information about how to donate also on our website. Also invite you to the next talk in our series, which will be on October 29th, featuring Dr. Eric Peterson, and you can look for that information also on the BMRC website. So without further ado, I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Nicholas.
All right, thanks so much, Maya. This is a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to you and to Lou and the rest of the BMRC staff. Everybody else also, thanks for taking a lunch break to learn a little Chicago history. I'm going to share my screen and get the presentation going. If you could give me a thumbs up, is that visible? And am I audible?
Okay, yes, perfect. Everything's good. Yeah.
Great, sounds good. So I'm going to begin by providing an overview of the larger research project and book project that my time as a summer short-term BMRC fellow was a part of. And after that, I'll take us on a kind of a tour, a two-stop tour to two specific and connected threads that came from archives at the Chicago History Museum and at the Harold Washington Library Center, where I spent the vast majority of my time. So first, to talk about the larger project. I'm currently at work on a book manuscript that attempts a political and intellectual history of urban education reform in late 20th century Chicago. I'm not the only one to write about this. There's plenty of other great books on this topic. But this journey that I'm trying to go on through ed policy from daily to daily, effectively, gives a local story about school reformers, the policy initiatives they launched, the urban neighborhoods that they sought to transform and renew. But it is also meant to be deliver kind of a bigger American story about the civic ideology of school reform and the multicultural ideologies of a post-civil rights nation. So in other words, one way of thinking about this is why is it that by the time we get to the millennium or so, certain cliches about education echo across partisan divides really loudly, really crisply. So no matter who you asked, by the time you get to the millennium, the quote was always that education reform is the quote civil rights issue of our day. So my book is a march through this kind of cascade of education initiatives, magnet schools, bilingual centers, local school councils, small schools, charter schools, and all of these programs that were pitched and launched and pitched here in Chicago between the 60s and the 90s were pitched by their advocates as projects of civic renewal, a means by which the individual striving and choosing undertaken by parents and their kids would somehow be directed toward these more lofty civic goals of racial reconciliation, spatial revitalization, and in some cases, democratic, small d democratic renaissance. But my point as a historian is that these initiatives are not just kind of one thing after the other. They sit inside these broader transformations. Both the contests that are fought, the coalitions that are formed, lessons that are learned, bargains that are struck, all of this stuff happened under different regimes of federal and state oversight and at distinct moments of transformation in the regional political economy. So taken together, I'm arguing that there's this gradual but decisive reorientation of education policy over this late 20th century period. And the kind of two key terms at either end of that period are the following. So at the beginning of the era, desegregation is the paradigm for education policy, especially in urban districts like Chicago that are facing civil rights pressure with regard to segregated schools. But I argue that desegregation is probably, from a historical point of view, best understood not just as a policy that kind of works or doesn't work, but actually a policy paradigm, a really vast forum into which an array of historical actors were drawn into sustained relationships, and in which educational problems were defined, research agendas were pursued, policies were proposed, and supportive publics were convened. And ultimately, a policy paradigm's fortunes rest on the durability and self-awareness of its constituents, both the experts who puzzle around inside the problem set that the paradigm creates, and those in the broader polity who actually perceive and receive the benefits that come out of that policy regime. So this deseg policy arena that emerged in the 1960s was really inseparable from the intellectual and political debates about how cities could best cope with crisis, so-called urban crisis of the end of the 1960s. And this was a catch-all term that included the flight of middle-class residents and businesses and the activation of new independent political formations among Black citizens who posed varying degrees of challenge to civic elites. In the case of Chicago, that would have been the Daily Machine, at its height in the 1960s. And these concerns, they play out at the bird's eye of metropolitan planning, but also in the local experiences that ordinary Chicagoans had in their neighborhoods and at their schoolhouses. So sometime between the early 70s and the mid 1990s, all these people who were involved in these policy debates, policy entrepreneurs, reformers, foundations, nonprofits, they're drawn into this paradigm of desegregation through a variety of mandates that require community participation. But they gradually become the organizers and architects of a new paradigm, which relies on something else, on convening intellectual communities of expertise, on accountable systems of school management and choice. So the successor paradigm, which I'll call the choice and accountability paradigm, combined a focus on standardized assessment of measurable academic outputs, along with the championing of site-based management, which is to say management at the localized schoolhouse level, effective school leadership, kind of the training of principals, and the encouragement of open attendance and enrollment systems to maximize parental choice. So these are the kind of the bundle of policies that come together. And these are, in fact, the bundle of policies that former Chicago Public Schools CEO Arne Duncan, upon his appointment to the Secretary of Education post by his fellow Chicagoan Barack Obama in 2009, that's what he meant to refer to when he said things like, we know what works, or we know what's possible. And so in a lot of accounts of this educational history, that this new paradigm kind of appears out of the blue in kind of a rise of neoliberalism story. So that's one version you might hear in some accounts of where this choice and ability stuff comes from. But I think this is a little too smooth a ride with ideas kind of unfolding seamlessly into policy, a nonstop flight from Milton Friedman's seminars in the 1950s to Arne Duncan's press conferences in the 2000s. And in some versions, the accountability movement in education is recast as a triumph of a conservative or corporate backlash to the community-driven spirit of an earlier era in the 1960s, when urban reformers who were imbued with this anti-authoritarian intellectual interventions of the late 1960s and who were trying to draw from what was left of urban social movements boosted the notion that schools needed to be revamped as tolerant and participatory spaces where cultural lives of students and the political voice of parents were invited into the educational process. So that's another version of the story. Credit for the choice movement, when it's not chalked up to the ambitions of libertarians, has been assigned by other historians to segregationists. In other words, where the policy creep of choice-driven enrollment is portrayed as light cover for darker motives of racial revanchism. And I would say there's definitely some truth to this. Much of the neighborhood level action that my account presents shows how people in Chicago, if they were hoping to either contain, disperse, or displace Black residents from certain parts of urban turf, could leverage assistance from these new school policies, which were nominally integrative or community driven. So there's some truth to that. But still, there are some discoveries from my research that make it pretty difficult to tell a story that puts either neoliberalism or segregationism in the driver's seat of this history. Back in the 1960s, choice was not the battle cry of the segregationists nor the libertarians, but rather a technocratic innovation of the liberal integrationists. And it was introduced in the absence of court-ordered deseg and as a kind of a tactical response to the anxieties and realities of white flight. And in the 1980s, similarly, the word accountability, far from being a corporate antagonist of community, was the watchword among a cadre of urban progressives who had cut their teeth on the experimentalist pedagogies and neighborhood nonprofits in the 1960s and 70s, when all of these academic, philanthropic, and ecclesiastical resources were turned toward what was called the social dynamite of the inner city. And so it was in this new mission field of urban affairs that many of these practitioners developed a sharp critique of urban bureaucracy and educational bureaucracies in particular. So those are some of the contexts that I'm trying to get at with the research that I'm up to. So I want to talk a little bit about the stuff I looked at in the summer here, and I'm going to start with the Harold Washington archives and collections at the Harold Washington Library Center, where I looked at the pre-mayoral campaign records, the chief of staff records, legislative liaison and intergovernmental affairs series, and the community services subcabinet records. And that allows a researcher like me to kind of move from before, during, and after Harold Washington's successful 1983 campaign for mayor, and to see how education actually moves from a sideline issue to an urgent political front by the mid-1980s. So a few contexts that are worth recalling here. Between the death of Mayor Richard J. Daley in 1976 and the election of Harold Washington in 1983, the Chicago school system faced a series of crises, fiscal crises, new desegregation mandates, and declining enrollments. In 1977, the State Board of Ed had put Chicago schools on a probationary status for its years of foot dragging on coming up with a desegregation plan and compelling a new citywide deseg initiative. This was followed by a full-scale finance crisis in 1979 to 80, which prompted pay freezes and program cuts, strike threats, deal brokering, and ultimately the creation of a five-person school finance authority. Simultaneously, federal authorities referred a long-simmering civil rights case to the Department of Justice for prosecution. So after months of negotiation with the DOJ, there was a deseg consent decree produced in September of 1980, introducing another layer of oversight to Chicago's school system. So all of this is happening in this interim kind of between the Daley and Washington eras. And it's also happening as the numbers of students in Chicago's schools are plummeting, with an average drop of 15,000 students lost out of CPS every year between 1977 and 1981. So those are the kind of the contexts to recall. But what I've been kind of interested in trying to reconstruct is the degree to which these crises and the ascendance of Reagan and the conservative movement at the national level shaped the expression of local Black politics. So my question that I'm kind of trying to get at is were the critiques of public education that emerged during this era, because there were a lot of critiques locally in Chicago, were these accelerated by the national contexts of Reaganomic austerity, or were they already traveling on their own trajectory here in the city? And how did somebody like Washington and his coalition see the relationship between the local calls for reform that they felt they needed to respond to, and these national conservative pledges to effectively defund big cities of their public educational dollars, slash federal spending, and devolve the functions of the Department of Education? So I'm still trying to hunt that down, but there are some things that I pulled out of these research visits over the summer that I think are worth thinking about in light of those questions. So when I was looking at these early campaign records from 1982 and 83, you can see, a lot of times what happens in these files is a collection of clippings, things that people in the Harold Washington team are pulling to inform their research briefs or their position papers that they're going to produce. And you can get a sense of what the issues are that are circulating at around that time that Washington and his team feel like they need to respond to. And these issue papers that start to be put out, and this is one of them, the one on education here, these were really key to the campaign's inner circle, and they were designed to be kind of first drafts of the transition papers for the new administration. And so as the research committee chair, Hal Barron, this is so was one of Washington's key advisors, his so-called idea man, and former research director for the Urban League, and a pretty prolific scholar in his own right. The way he put it is that these papers would allow Washington to convey a sense of mastery and purpose over the issues, and an opportunity to corral and engage expertise from a wide range of organizations, businesses, and interest groups. So a lot of this is it's an opportunity to, in writing these papers, get all these different nonprofit kind of neighborhood-based organizations, as well as university-based researchers and friends in the business community, to start contributing to the thought leadership on these different issues that Washington is going to shepherd. So for Barron and the fellow research committee members here, we have Lerone Bennett, Vince Bakeman, and actually Bill Berry, who's the campaign chair. The idea here is that these are supposed to communicate inclusive and equitable issue definition and decision making, is the way that they put it. And the promise being that groups who were previously excluded from decision making would be included in the planning process. And for Bill Berry, he's actually Hal Barron's former boss at the Urban League back during the high point of civil rights organizing. Bill Berry says that it's these position papers as they're drafted in the early 80s kind of elevate Washington and mature him in stature to become a national spokesman for progressive politics, as they put it, during the Reagan era. So it's kind of these papers are interesting because you can see them turn into the transition team's papers over the course of the files there. But still, what I noticed is that in these early position papers, education is actually it's important, but not central to the Washington team's view of mobilizing voters. Still, the team's ed policy statements and the many articles that they're circulating, you can see how they're judging the relative salience or peril of certain education issues. So a lot of these early drafts took this idea that that education is needed for growth, by which they meant individual growth for students, but also the economic development on a municipal scale. So a lot of understanding of education as creating a job-ready workforce for the city. But in Washington's framing, the current picture was bleak. Failure to teach even the basics, a high school dropout rate of 55%, a trend in employers spending to retrain people in the job after they had come out of the Chicago public school system. Washington and his team chalk up these failures to a series of fiscal bungles on the part of Jane Byrne, his opponent, the incumbent mayor, as someone who was inept to get out from under these high interest loans and old debts, and unable to find creative state and federal sources of funding. And then in addition, he and his team are condemning what they call managerial confusion, blaming Byrne for dropping experienced members from the board and growing the sector of administrators in the central office making over $50,000 a year. So from 2 to 54 of these people in the downtown office. And that particular question, the question of how are people in the bureaucracy being paid and what are they doing? This is a really key point of conflict in the early 1980s in education reform. But very early on, we can see that Washington has to take a cautious approach to this critique of the central bureaucracy, advocating for what they called limited and responsible decentralization. Because this is, again, by the early 1980s, advocates both local and national are identifying bureaucratic bloat as a key source of urban educational crisis. And in Chicago, the people advancing these critiques are actually key members of Washington's coalition. So these are people in the progressive research community, a network of academics, journalists, nonprofit leaders, philanthropists that are backing Washington, supplying him with research on various policy questions. Prominent among these are groups like Stan and Anna Hallett's Center for Neighborhood Technology, Don Moore's Designs for Change, the logo you see here, and Fred Hess's Chicago panel on school policy and finance. Same time as this is happening, many across the city's Black commentariat are voicing a kind of a fed up attitude with regard to the current state of teacher and principal quality. In the Chicago Defender, Robert Sengstack is, although his paper is kind of suffering from declining readership and a lack of credibility in Black Chicago at the turn of the 1980s, there's still quite a bit of commentary through those pages on the idea that the school system contains more, this is a quote from one of their editorials, the school system contains more than its share of deadbeats who do as little as necessary to collect their paychecks. And so on the pages of the Defender, you can find voicing opinions in support of merit pay for people working in the school system as a way to kind of spur more productive approaches to their jobs. In the citywide dailies, prominent journalists like Lou Palmer and Vernon Jarrett had penned multiple profiles of disorderly schools throughout the prior decade and lauded the kind of instances of school turnarounds at the hands of more no-nonsense administrators. People like Alice Blair is kind of features in a lot of their stories. Even activist energy echoes these emphases. So a pretty prominent and rising figure in the Washington coalition in this campaign moment is at that point a parent organizer, Dorothy Tillman, later on goes on to become an alderwoman. But she is at that point leading local fights to oust unsatisfactory principals and swinging the energy of this parent network that she has, the parent equalizers, into Washington's campaign. But as many chroniclers of Washington's school reform efforts have pointed out, the public sector administrators that worked at the Board of Education, whose numbers had risen, risen substantially over the previous decade, many of them are also a key constituency for Washington's coalition. So attempts to oust administrators or endorse parental control or clean house at the central office could be destabilizing to those bases of support. And so you notice in both mayoral campaigns and during his administration, Washington and his team are consciously avoiding or trying to temper the term decentralization, which had come to be seen as basically a use of euphemism for firing of Black bureaucrats. So this is a item of sensitivity within the Washington camp. So as I move forward in the Harold Washington archives, I tracked this kind of clear spike in the urgency that education issues took on in Washington's inner circle. So by the time that Washington's bid for a second term was approaching, his team warned that the mayor needed to take a more active and public role in the schools. When they were reviewing their kind of accomplishments to date in November of 1985, Mayor's Policy Council confessed that it was clear that one of our weakest areas has been education. education. And they kind of chalk this up to both unclear objectives and a lack of publicization of the things that they had accomplished. So we kind of skip ahead, further into the documents here as you move through 86 and into 87, you start to see the appearance in the files of a lot of these school reform movement white papers and statements and press releases. So things coming from groups like School Watch or from Designs for Change or the Chicago Panel. These are voices of reform that are starting to coalesce, and they're being echoed not just by the parents that they organize and the kind of nonprofit leaders, but also state legislators in Springfield and business community in Chicago. So there's kind of a three-front coalescence. And you can see in some of the memos circulated within the Washington administration, especially if you move past the moment of his reelection into 1987, there's a memo that from Hal Barron to Washington that warns the team that the administrators at CPS, both of whom were Washington allies, so we have the board president Frank Gardner and the superintendent Manfred Bird, that their posture is actually becoming a liability to the Washington administration. And if the Washington administration wants to successfully stave off, this is a quote from the memo, stave off a second round of potentially destructive decentralization proposals in Springfield, the Board of Education needs to seize the initiative to fashion a local response. So this is in the moment of a lengthy teacher strike at the beginning of the 1987 school year, and part of the series of triggers that brings Washington and his team to convene an education summit later in 1987 that starts to become the incubator for the enactment of some of these school reform initiatives. But I want to jump back to 83 here, because one of the other things that I came across in the Herald Washington files is memos from many people trying to bend the campaign manager's ear. So this is Al Raby, who's also a veteran civil rights activist in Chicago, part of the original CCCO during the 1960s, but at this point in the early 80s is the chair of Washington's campaign. One of the memos that I came across of somebody trying to kind of lobby Raby for what to do was a note from John McDermott. And John McDermott was a progressive Catholic and a journalist based in Kenwood, but more prominently, he was the editor and publisher of the Chicago Reporter, which is was a very influential newsletter and arm of the Community Renewal Society, which reported to the city's, kind of the audience was the city's progressives and independents throughout the 1970s and 80s, and continues to do so. But reporting specifically on issues of race and inequality. And you can see here the kind of the description from John McDermott of what the Reporter does in its coverage of race relations issues. So across the prior decade since its founding, McDermott and his very self-consciously interracial crew of reporters who work for the Chicago Reporter had conducted extensive, detailed audits on racial disparity in every employment sector every year. So there's an annual reports that they would do. And they had broken these kind of bigger stories on corruption and misallocation all the way in every city department. So everything from the fire department to the police department to the school system to the drawing of aldermanic ward maps. So McDermott, his reporters, and the Chicago Reporter have a lot of cred as a source of research-based investigative journalism on questions of racial inequality. But in this particular memo that I came across, McDermott doesn't pitch himself to Raby in Washington as a kind of a race and corruption journalist, but rather as what I'm going to call a white ethnic Catholic whisperer. And so what McDermott says in the memo, and I don't have a picture of the memo here to show you, but what he does in this memo is urges Raby not to write off his fellow white Catholics as instinctive racists, which is apparently something that he was worried about in the kind of Washington campaign circle, and to get Washington out on a cycle of coffee sessions with Catholic leaders. And so McDermott tries to stage this argument in this memo, saying that, it's the institutions of the Catholic Archdiocese actually way more invested in Black Chicago than you might think. And they're more invested in Black Chicago than the Protestant and Jewish counterparts in the white community, because many of them, those institutions and congregations, had fled to the suburbs along with their with their congregants. Whereas Catholic institutions remained in the city and were now deeply embedded in Black Chicago, educating some 30,000 Black students in the city. And so McDermott is pushing this as kind of a way to bridge, Black Chicago and white ethnic Catholic Chicago. And at the same time, he's writing op-eds in that same moment, even promoting tuition tax credits or a voucher system to encourage the continuance of what he called inner city private and parochial schools, which could, in his argument, serve as a healthy prod for the reform of the public schools. So I found this was a curious document to come across, because you're getting kind of a pro-voucher progressivism in the early 1980s, which I hadn't really known that much about. But it did also spur my recollection of an article I had seen in McDermott's Chicago Reporter from an issue in the early 1980s. And that sent me over to the Chicago History Museum, because at the Chicago History Museum, you can go and look at the Chicago Reporter's records, including the actual reporter's notebooks, which is a really cool collection there to take a look at. So you can kind of pivot back and forth between personal papers of John McDermott and the work of his reporters as they're doing these big deep dive stories on race and inequality in Chicago in the 70s and 80s. And the one that I started to focus on in these collections was a young Laura Washington, who is, as some of you know, goes on, to become have a very prolific and prominent career as a Chicago journalist, including ultimately a stint as the deputy press secretary for Harold Washington, no relation, and as the editor and publisher of the Chicago Reporter later on in the 1990s. But back at this point, Laura Washington is a young journalist, but rising, quickly in local Chicago ecosystem. And if you're kind of bouncing back and forth in these files, you really get an interesting picture of how a story is made. So you can look at Laura Washington's notebooks, John McDermott's memos, the reference and research material that's used to develop the story. And you start to realize how the story on Black Catholic education began. A lot of it was about John McDermott's desire to revisit a story that he published back in 1974, which was about the kind of state of racial integration happening in the Chicago schools, which he thought was happening more thoroughly and more successfully in the Catholic context than it was in the public context in the early 1970s. But by the end of the 70s, there was new data available from the Archdiocese that he wanted somebody to start crunching and to do a story about what was happening with Catholic education and race relations. And you can see then also some of the other media that McDermott is consuming. So this is from his files. You see a commentary on Black Catholic education, local coverage of kind of early accountability proposals to try to crack down on teacher quality, and then some of the more conservative national literature. So Chester Finn, who's working for the U.S. Department of Education under Reagan, talking about the need for more competition in school systems. So not to say that McDermott is endorsing any one of these different resources, but you can get a sense of what's the milieu, what kind of intellectual sources is he working from to push a local story in Chicago. So in any case, you can get into the notebooks then, and you can see how Laura Washington is doing her tallying and interviewing, how she turns the interview notes then into a transcript that she then vets with McDermott, and see how that turns into a story. But what I found interesting is that you see for Washington, as she's starting to interview parents and school leaders, the story that she is developing starts to move far beyond the question that McDermott had her look at in the beginning, which was racial integration, and started to dovetail more thematically with another story that she had completed recently about the growth of non-public Black independent schools in Chicago. And so as Washington developed this story, a different theme starts to emerge. And this is a memo from McDermott to Washington here. complimenting the fact here that this story has undergone a transformation from what we originally had in mind. It is not just a story about Catholic school desegregation, although that is part of it. The fact is that there's not much to report on that issue alone. It does not warrant a major story. The major story lies elsewhere, pegged on Laura's exclusive finding of a turnaround in Catholic school enrollment in Chicago, an increase at this time of the largest drop in public school enrollment in many years. And I think this last point that he makes in this memo, where he's kind of trying to explain why this is such a big story, shows you how we're moving from the deseg paradigm to the accountability paradigm, to revisit those two ends of the timeline that I was talking about. And he says here, the main point of this story should be to explain why this is taking place. And this requires a story about why Blacks are turning to Catholic schools, why these schools, quote unquote, work, and why and how they are able to survive and what is their future. So this idea of schools that work, or effective schools, this is the language in the 1980s, much more so than languages of integration or desegregation, even though those legal mandates remain in place. But you kind of see these reporters, Washington and McDermott, pushing themselves into this new paradigm as they're doing this story. So when the story is first published in February '81, this is some more of Laura Washington's research material when she's working on that, on the Black independent school movement. But again, you see Providence St. Mel's on the west side being an important story that people are following. And then the Marva Collins, another educational entrepreneur on the west side, who by 1981 has a made-for-TV movie made about her with Cicely Tyson playing her and Morgan Freeman in it and all the rest. So as a journalist, Washington is collecting kind of other journalists' accounts of these things, but then doing her own homework and visiting out to these Black independent schools to come up with a story about what their appeal seems to be. And one of the things she discovers is that the discontent with public education seemed to have less to do with questions of integration per se, or even of religion per se, if we're thinking about the Catholic schools, but with a sense that the traditional rhythms of authority and discipline, which we might think of as both academic discipline and personal discipline, that these were being neglected in the public system. So much of what these independent schools are promoting themselves upon is this notion of being a more disciplined environment, both behaviorally and academically. So when McDermott gets this published, he instantly sends out press releases to everybody that he can to get them to listen to this. Sends out to friendly Black politicos, like at that point his friend Congressman Harold Washington, but provocatively, at the end of all of these letters, he has a paragraph in there of direct advocacy on behalf of this idea of the tuition tax credit movement, arguing, as he put it, he's like, I don't think such a reform would destroy the public schools, but it will force them to compete harder for students and for the respect of Black parents. Now, he pushes this notion out there, but gets pushed back from some of his letter correspondence. So, for instance, this is him writing or getting a letter back from then State Representative Carol Mosley Braun, who says here in her response, cordially but pretty clearly, that she doesn't see that urban Democrats are interested in redirecting public funds toward private schools in the midst of an ongoing fiscal crisis. And similarly, not long after this, in the same moment that this story is being released, superintendent of the schools at that point in the early '80s, Ruth Love, also says that tries to put out kind of an institutional statement about this notion of tax credit proposals. She says here, it is clear that middle and upper income persons stand to gain the most from these tax credit proposals. They are the families whose incomes permit them to send their children to private schools. The vast majority of poor people, large numbers of whom are Black, Hispanic, and other minorities, will in the foreseeable future attend public schools, and it is the public schools that stand to lose by the tuition tax credit proposal. So you can see this kind of testing out and pushing back on some of these quasi-privatization schemes that are afoot in the early 1980s. So I'm gonna leave it there. The conclusions that I will I'll gently add here. I think it's I feel obliged to acknowledge my own priors here. So I'm a lifelong Chicagoan. I'm an educator. I'm a former high school public high school teacher, and now I'm a trainer of social studies teachers here in Chicago at National Louis University. And my interest in this history, my interest in the history of education in Chicago flows pretty directly from those experiences, from my having been a student, having been a teacher, a parent, an LSC rep, a union member, all the rest. But one has to be very careful, like when you're a historian, to not mistake your familiarity with your subject with expertise. So there's something misleading about knowing your city so well and knowing some of these names in politics, and then being awakened to the fact that you don't know nearly as much as you did when you start to visit the archives. So I'll leave that as just kind of a moment of instruction for all of us. So thanks very much for the time.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. That was a really great talk. And although it seems our discussant has had some kind of technical issue and is not able to join us today, I think it was so stimulating, and I know I certainly learned a lot, that I think we will have no problem with giving you some questions and feedback from the audience here, if you accept it. People can feel free to type questions or comments into the chat and or unmute themselves and ask questions. Maybe I'll start us off then. I mean, one thing, I'm always kind of archive centered. So I'm wondering, it's interesting to see your trajectory if you see one thing that's leading you to the next thing. What's the most surprising thing that you came across from this summer's research? I know you've probably done that really was maybe made you ask more questions, or that you just weren't expecting to find, or added some added dimension to this discussion?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to think. I mean, as you kind of hinted at, so I'm I had this time thanks to the BMRC this summer, but I'm a resident here in Chicago, so I'm often at the archives, on a kind of an intermittent basis. And this is like the gift and the curse of living in the city that you study, which is that the convenience is, you can always go to the archives, but then you can always get stuck in the archives. So you need to draw a line at some point to figure out what you want to say about what you've studied. But I really enjoy the serendipity that you talk about, where you are looking at one thing and then kind of curious and puzzled by it, and then that leads you to another thread. And sometimes you collect these things and you can't pursue them right away, but maybe you're going to pick them up later. So one of those that I remember, I was looking at in the Harold Washington archives this summer. There's a whole section of them kind of analyzing the Latino vote, or the Hispanic vote, that they were trying to figure out how to court during the first '83 campaign. And you see them doing there was kind of like there was literature that they were developing for certain voters in the Puerto Rican quarter of Chicago, and in kind of West Town, near Northwest Side, and then other materials that they were developing for Mexican Americans and Mexican Chicagoans in Pilsen, or on the southeast side. And then when they were looking at I was kind of struck by how I think the people who were developing their messaging for the Puerto Rican vote, they were leaning in a very radical direction. Which wasn't really even necessarily the tone of the Washington campaign, but I think they must have understood that some of the more politically active people in those Puerto Rican neighborhoods were also more far left progressives, and needed to be appealed to on the basis of that particular politics. Not to say that everybody in the Puerto Rican neighborhood were of that same perspective, but they had a sense of, these are the politically active people. So that was interesting to see that there. But then they had a bunch of data on their what do you call it, exit polling research that they did in the Mexican and Puerto Rican enclaves, and you see that the Washington is really not successful in the Mexican neighborhoods of the southeast side in the first round. That they're basically seeing him being, he's not winning those contests in the primary. So just interesting data that I'm, if I were doing a political history of, Black and Hispanic political activity, I would chase that a little more. But for me, it's a sideshow because I'm trying to focus on schools and school reform. But those are the surprises that you come across.
So there's a question that Kimberly Black, who's one of our board members, has put in the chat. Could you connect the history of school choice, et cetera, to the present moment that we are experiencing? What are the possible plausible futures for education based on the past?
Mhm. Um, yeah, I mean, I would, the historian is always cautious in trying to use history as a blueprint for the future. I mean, I always say that history definitely explains the present, but it doesn't predict the future. But that having been said, I think there are some interesting. Um, I guess it depends which aspects of the present moment Kimberly is mentioning, referring to. But I think one thing that I noticed when I was writing up the notes for today was that in that early 1980s moment, um, Harold Washington and his team are consciously trying to pose themselves against Reaganism. Right, that Reagan is the ascendant vehicle for the conservative movement at the national level. They are this local vehicle for the progressive movement in the Chicago context. And so, Washington is saying we're moving away from bossism towards pluralism, and we are how do they put it? We're fighting against Reaganism, Thompsonism, and Eptonism. So this is both the federal, state, and local versions of Republican politics are kind of a foe for them. And one of the things that they're trying to oppose is this the slashing and gutting of federal responsibility for education and educational civil rights, which Reagan, is making clear that he wants to basically devolve power away from the federal Department of Education, actually abolish it, which also, again, to Kimberly's point, sounds familiar with regard to promises that Trump has made as well. Reagan was the first person to do that because the DOE had really just been founded under Carter. Um, and one thing that you might take from that, however, which there's other historians have written about this, is that Reagan doesn't abolish the Department of Education. And in fact, some of the work that he does in that with the Nation at Risk report of 1983 is to actually raise the profile of education with regard to the federal government's role in it. So there's this irony in that Reagan comes in promising to devolve and destroy these responsibilities over education, but the education, that profile at the federal level actually grows across the 80s, and then even more so in the 90s. So that would be one possible connection to present tense context that we could add. But I see we have Toussaint here now, so maybe we can get him in.
Sure. So, welcome, Toussaint. Nicholas has finished his presentation, and we're in the question period. If you did want to respond, Toussaint, you're more than welcome to join the conversation.
I mean, I can continue to respond a little bit to Kimberly's question too. That one of the school choice question, which is a big part of the research that I'm looking at. I think that by the time we get to the 1980s, the early 1980s, some of the era that we were discussing today, uh, that's more or less when choice is moving from kind of a technical solution to an ideological agenda. So in other words, it's the introduction of choice comes by way of the magnet school proposals, which come in the 1960s and early 70s. And they're used in this kind of technical way to achieve curated racial integration in cities where there is no court-ordered busing program, and where there's also all this concern about scaring off white populations by any kind of mandated um, pupil integration scheme. So the magnet schools kind of introduced that choice idea, and then that's ratified twice over by two different school policies, one in 1977, one in the early 80s. And it's those two programs which really give us in Chicago the current landscape of public school choice, so magnet schools and selective enrollment schools, and the idea of having a neighborhood attendance school that you can attend, but also having this menu of options that are out there. But it's not really until the early 80s that starts to become advocated for as a reform policy in of itself, that choice is the thing that is going to remake and improve the schools at scale. And so that's something I think that happens, kind of gradually in that at the turn of the 80s. And then, you could see in the people who McDermott is reading, you're starting to get this other set of voices, some from a conservative perspective, saying that that is the shakeup, that is the ingredient that we need to change the schools.
Thank you so much. I know that we're at time for the hour, and I know some people will have to leave, but we do have Tucson joining us, and welcome. We've introduced you before you arrived, so feel free if you, since you're familiar with the discussion, to give your feedback to Dr. Nicholas if you're able to. Yes.
Yeah, first and foremost, I just have to apologize. I'm generally go about my day being remiss because I no longer live in Chicago, and my my delayed arrival to this meeting is largely because of a function that being on the East Coast in my own scheduling of this talk, I had the time zone wrong. So my sincere apologies for that. I think some of the line of questioning that you all were just going over really speaks to some of the curiosities and questions that I had around this project. And I'll just say, for my own perspective, as someone whose interest very much lies in questions of urban politics, but is not like the expertise is not necessarily in questions of education. I really thought the opportunity that this project presents to kind of like decenter what some have called the neoliberal turn, and frame it not simply in terms of a question of sort of like broad scale kind of macroeconomic shifts that are reflected in education policy, but this approach to looking at like a policy program approach to what some of those shifts look like. It was really interesting. And at some points I was like, I have both curiosities, but also I think real interest in what looking at not only the sort of like incremental and sort of resonance between sort of like, fifth floor city hall decision making, as well as some of the ways in which it's taken up at the grassroots level, how this is reflected, but also what I gathered in if this is a wrong understanding of what the project looks like, but really this approach to thinking about some of the kind of layer of advocates, policy experts, education reformers who are trying to kind of make a way, working not simply at the grassroots level and not simply in the sort of bureaucracy of the Department of Education and what have you, but are sort of policy entrepreneurs, right? Like their efforts to shift these to introduce questions of school choice and to shift the needle on some of the questions of school desegregation, increased funding for public schools, like what that looks like, by framing them and their work as like key historical actors, right? I think one of the things I was I was most curious about is to what degree is the broader project looking at the relationship, and maybe I missed this in some of the presentation, but the relationship between those historical actors and some of the different forces within the Chicago Teachers Union in terms of their degree to which their ability to move forward particular policy agendas are encumbered by the advocacy of teachers and some of the different shifts in leadership that happened within the teachers union during this particular period. And then I think in a bigger picture sense, one of the other questions that I had, and this really comes out of more pushback that I've gotten in some of my own scholarship on, say, sort of like questions of incarceration is that oftentimes um, uh, um, in an effort to kind of offer a broad scale frame of the way things are happening that include, right, the key sort of historical contributions of people of African descent, we can often get caught up in sort of a black-white paradigm and what have you. And um, one of the key transformations that allowed the second daily to be able to move some of his policy agenda was really not only the broad scale demographic shifts in Chicago that included an expansion of the city's Latino population, but particularly the consolidation of um, um, a lot of that constituency under um, um, within the second daily administration, the Hispanic Democratic Organization, and the degree to which that organization and its connection to a lot of the emerging school reform energies that are captured in I believe it was the Little Village hunger strike, and some of the other activism that took place at the grassroots level in some of the city's Latino neighborhoods. To what degree did um, that key constituency shape the ability of the daily administration to have more room to maneuver in terms of shaping the city's um, uh, kind of educational policies in ways that might have been different during um, the latter years, well, perhaps some of the latter years of the Harold Washington administration, but also, Sawyer's brief time in office and what have you. So those are some of my initial thoughts. But as I said earlier, the comment that you offered, particularly in terms of thinking about some of the ways in which your own research now resonates with kind of contemporary debates, uh, spoke to a couple questions that I had of my own, and then as I kind of offered at the outset, yeah, I was just curious about your own general approach to thinking about this layer of kind of policy advocates and folks who are trying to be somewhat creative and entrepreneurial in terms of how they approach some of these um, pressing questions of public education, what it means to sort of see them as like key kind of historical actors.
Yeah. No, those are great. I mean, you summarize it quite accurately as far as like what I think that strata that you're talking about of people are really important historical actors, but they kind of in the introduction, I was trying to make gesture towards this point, is that I don't think they get space to do what they do or become what they become without deseg as this broader kind of legal architecture, intellectual problem set that kind of determines school policy in one era. And then, my argument is that as they move through that problem set, they get frustrated, they sometimes get exhausted, they look for routes out, and they do this kind of entrepreneurship that you're talking about, where they're like, well, let's try, innovating, let's try these other things. And it's through those programs that you get this other paradigm, the trust and accountability world. And that one, and I'm still kind of moving into the 90s, in my writing. I'm in there archivally, but I still need to draft those sections. But I think there's a very important shift that happens it's actually during the Sawyer administration, I think, where when they actually launched the local school council, law and councils in effect, some of the major players in getting that legislation going and then studying it are the philanthropies, the big major philanthropic actors in Chicago. And their lesson that they take from that is that, wow, if we all move in the same direction, if we push our money towards a thing called school reform, in this case, local school councils, we can make things happen. And so there's a number of other initiatives that happened in the 90s where the philanthropists start to become much more, they basically kind of suck in all those entrepreneurial reformers and have them become program officers or, other, or grant people who try to get grants from them to do some of these experimental local school initiatives in the 90s. But that's just an interesting transformation to me, to see the philanthropic community become kind of a parallel policy world by the 90s. And that, I think some of those entrepreneurs in the 70s were kind of sensing that that's what you need to do if you want to make your way through a place like Chicago, where the kind of bureaucracy and the machine control politics. And if you're a kind of an urban progressive or an independent, you need to start getting these philanthropies to fund your nonprofit and organize yourself with parents in a kind of a community structure. But the real community that's being assembled are the philanthropists, but like over the long term. So that transformation, and I don't know if that's neoliberalism or what that is, but it's an interesting story to me to see how they become in there. And like you say, that strata of kind of policy advocates and experts, they're important. And I think their expertise changes. Like what they were expert at in the 70s was organizing parents, because they had a lot of their roots in those social movement traditions and neighborhood-based organizing traditions. And so that was what gave them cred. But in the 90s, the people who were getting grants, there's still some of those same people, but also the research community, the academic, the people at the Chicago Consortium for School Research and these other academic outfits. They're the ones that are kind of they're bringing a different ticket for credibility now to what it means to be an ed expert by the 90s. So that's I'm still kind of writing that trajectory out, but yeah, that's definitely what I'm interested in. And you mentioned the role of Hispanic politics across this whole era. I have a whole chapter called what is it? Inventing Latinos in the 70s. So there's a really important way in which educational civil rights, as specifically inclusive of bilingual education, creates a new block of kind of political understanding. And you can see in the 70s, Daley and his Hispanic surrogates are competing with the progressives and their Latino organization, they're Latino nonprofits for this constituency, and they're both kind of throwing whatever they can at this newly politically awakened and federally designated group to kind of like build a politics around it. But that's all happening on top of pretty stark lines of residential segregation between Black and Hispanic communities, right? So the color line, the sharpest color line in the city is the one running between Pilsen and Little Village and North Lawndale, right? So that's a really important part of the story, especially when you're talking about schoolhouses that are or aren't going to be integrated across these ethnic lines.
If I could respond, and I again really apologize for the confusion around the time difference. I think to speak to one of your larger points, it's been fascinating to me as someone who entered grad school in like the mid 2000s, how at a moment, my sort of like intellectual trajectory at that moment started at a moment where people didn't really have in the US, didn't have a language around neoliberalism, in contrast to what existed in other parts of the world, right? So if I was reading about developments on the African continent, in Latin America, in Asia, what have you, particularly in terms of critiques of different policies, there was a language and a grasp of what neoliberalism was. And I think there's been a slow, real development and sort of kind of cohesion around some of that. I think what I see your project doing, or at least some of what I understand that I see your project doing, is kind of unpacking the way in which questions of this sort of neoliberalization of education, or at least like a neoliberal turn in education policy. Some of the contradictory aspects of that, or the kind of unexpected actors who played a role in some of those transformations, or even the degree to which what we understand to be a sort of like kind of corporate agenda or corporate policy when it comes to education might not necessarily be as kind of like black and white or sort of as stark as we would assume it to be. And I do think, just to your point, the point that you raised recently in terms of that question of philanthropies playing an important role in terms of the development of some of that policy, you know, I think there's a case to be made about that that is a component part of at least the way in which sort of neoliberalism has rolled out. I'm less an expert on questions of, like, say, housing policy or what have you. But if you look at the emergence of not only um, uh, efforts to kind of pivot away from public housing, but also introduce questions of sort of like mixed income um, housing developments and other points of kind of like affordable housing, what have you. A lot of that has been carried forward by both kind of like think tank um, um, uh, research and analysis, but also some of the experimental projects carried forward by different like foundations as well too. So I think that there's a way in which, you know, I guess the point I'm trying to make is I think that there's a way in which um, we've sort of developed a kind of a general, whether it's common sense or even sort of academic language, as denoting sort of neoliberalism as sort of like, these are things that are the bad stuff, you know what I'm saying? Like, this are the things that we don't like, or what have you. Um, and from a starkly kind of policy agenda, to the degree to which those experiments around school choice, as well as local school councils, some of the legislation around that, and some of the key role that philanthropies played in helping to make that possible. Um, you know, I think there's certainly ways in terms of understanding and appreciating that as part of this broader sort of neoliberal shift. Um, but in a way in which we might not necessarily sort of like denote or like assume that the actors involved in that are the kind of actors that we normally associate with a kind of neoliberal agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's it's a really important sector to appreciate, in especially in urban politics, just like the role of these foundations and where they, and I'm sure there's some sort of bird's eye argument to make about, their growing confidence or their growing profile has something to do with filling in the space that's being abandoned by the state, but that the state isn't necessarily like, I mean, in some cases, I guess in Chicago, I think you could argue that the state is in fact like sometimes asking the philanthropies to take these things over, like, but then there's also like, there's collisions that happen. Like in the 90s, there's a project called the Annenberg Challenge, which brings a lot of, new school reform initiatives into the Chicago public schools. And one of the requirements for any school getting a grant from the Annenberg Challenge is that the school, the whatever school program it was, had to be partnered with a neighborhood-based organization, and that the money had to flow only through them and not through the coffers of the Chicago public schools. And this was very frustrating to Paul Vallis, who was the CEO of the Chicago public schools, saying, "Here's all this money going to public school reform, and the steward of the public charge can't touch it." Like, and it is an interesting concept, and everybody who's kind of lining up behind it is, coming at this from a progressive kind of ed reform mindset. But it is an odd concept if you think about it in terms of governance, or like democratic governance over public education and its funding, right?
I know we're at time, but can I just maybe just touch on that last point real quickly?
Sure, sure. Go ahead.
So is there a way of getting to this question of neoliberalism? Is there a way, and this is sort of threaded through your presentation, but to kind of put a finer point on it, is there a way of understanding within the context of urban politics that a key part of what has generally been defined as neoliberalism can involve sort of like a mixed group of actors, because in some ways it pretty much shows up as like kind of a not necessarily like a rolling back of the welfare state as much as it's a rolling back of particular forms of bureaucracy. And it might not necessarily mean that you end up with less bureaucracy at the end of the day. It's just sort of a rolling back of currently existing forms of bureaucracy, and those could be replaced with others, what have you.
Yeah, no, that's a great, yeah, and the elaboration of like a, let 1,000 bureaucracies bloom or something across all these different nonprofits, and it does create another set of employment sectors for a different set of credentialed professionals. I mean, that's an interesting thing too. Like what got you into the bureaucracy in the old system under Daley or even under Washington was who you knew in the Democratic Party. How do you get your places in these dispersed nonprofit bureaucracies? Some of it's still connected to the party, I think, in many cases, but also it's a little more diffuse, like that, how this kind of legitimation and vouching for people happens through those networks.
Yeah, would only conclude, and I know we're at time, that I think that's an important um, addition to the conversation around how people think about the sort of like neoliberalization of education and sort of where we've ended up to some degree in terms of thinking about the current state of education, and also who are the constituencies that are involved, that have been involved in terms of shaping our current landscape, and also kind of driving the bus to some degree in terms of what the future looks like.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you both so much. We appreciate you joining us. We're grateful to be able to support this research. And the recording will be up on our YouTube channel in a few weeks if people would like to see it. And thanks again, and thanks everyone who stayed as well to the event.